Welcome to Beyond Belief, Tales of Religious Exodus, where we delve into the personal journeys of people who've left fundamentalist religions. In this series, we explore their experiences within religion, their journey out, and how they found meaning and healing on the other side.
All right, Mike, welcome back to the Beyond Belief podcast. I think you are the first returning guest, and we are here today to talk about Zionism. And you might be asking, how is Zionism related to leaving religion? And that is kind of, I think, the starting point that we would discuss today. The premise being that actually, this form of nationalism is very similar to religion and has a lot of parallels. And moving away from that can have its own reconstruction or deconstruction journey. And that's kind of the premise. So really just starting with that, I'd love to hear, your take as somebody who's, I guess, at this point left both religion and Zionism as a form of nationalism. What do you feel that there are parallels or differences between the two?
Well, first off, thanks for having me back. I'm flattered to be the first repeat guest. I think there are definitely parallels, and it's interesting for me because I left religion over a decade ago, actually like 15 years ago, and this process that I've gone through, which I'm sure we'll get into, is much more recent. So it's very fascinating for me to kind of go through a process of deconstruction much later in life, and it's much more fresh in my mind to have seen the process unfold. There are definitely parallels. I mean, a couple that come to mind just off the top of my mind is one, a lot of intolerance around dissent, right? And there's kind of like a third rail that you're not supposed to touch. You can criticize Israel, you can call out certain policies, but if you're anti-Zionist, you're dead. And you're a self-hating Jew, you're anti-Semitic, whatever, just whatever we need to lob on you to make it illegitimate. And you get similar things in religion. And the other element that I think is very striking that parallels is and it's kind of related to what I just mentioned, it's just the emotional attachment, where they're at a certain point, it's not really rational. It's just, this feels right, this feels good. And that's, that's essentially where it ends, and anything beyond that gets, rejected pretty quickly. So yeah, just to start out there.
Yeah, I like that. I wrote an article recently where I made the case, and I don't know if you'd agree with this. I made the case that leaving the superior nationalist view, it actually has more downsides than like leaving religion. Religion carries with it, there's a sense making of the world. There's something very familiar, but oftentimes it's very restrictive, and oftentimes for us, it's not working on a very day-to-day fundamental level, like all these restrictions and all these laws, and you're like, at some point, you're like, fuck this. And there's often a philosophical component as well. So when you step out of religion and you're stepping into freedom, there's like an immediate relief a lot of times. That's like when I contemplate, certainly that was my journey. And you're probably torn and conflicted, but also, as our friend once said, when he stopped keeping Shabbat, he got 1/7 of his life back, right? You get all that extra freedom of time. When I stopped to pray, I had hours a day of freedom. Those are like two examples. I feel like stepping out of the superior nationalist view, which says, oh yeah, I have a right to this land, and I'm doing the right thing, and everything I do is correct. There's no upside to be gained from saying, oh yeah, actually I'm on the wrong side, right? There is no, you only lose. It's kind of how I've contemplated it. Of course, there's that moral alignment, right? So that's on a pure philosophical level, you're back again with being aligned with what you believe. But on the practical level, I feel like it's just been worse. I mean, we're here to talk about your journey, but I think I've found leaving Zionism much harder than leaving religion.
I think it's an interesting point. I would agree with that. I think, this is a point that Peter Beinart makes. I'll probably be mentioning him a lot in this conversation because he's had a big impact on my process. But, why should we expect Israelis and Jews to renounce this ideology? It's as self-serving as it gets, right? It's like have your cake and eat it too celebration. And so there are very few incentives to let go of it. And I think you kind of mentioned it towards the end. I've gained a lot going through this process because I've found a new community. I feel very close to other Jewish anti-Zionists, and I feel morally aligned. And I feel like I'm closer to the truth. So it's actually been a very fulfilling journey, I would say, for myself. And at the same time, yeah, it's not. The way I describe this to people now is that I was dragged kicking and screaming to this conclusion. I was not trying to arrive at these new ways of looking at this conflict, right? It was forced upon me by reality. And so
And
I'm really
would you
glad it
say that?
happened. And it
Yeah.
wasn't like, yeah, let me become anti-Zionist. That looks cool, you know? Yeah.
Would you not say, though, most people I've interviewed, also when they talk about religion, there's usually an element of reluctance there too, actually, of kicking and screaming. Not to say that there aren't differences, but almost everybody I've spoke to has said, like, yeah, in a way, if I could make it work, I wish it did, because it was really, important. Religion was really important and meaningful to me.
Yeah, I think there's often an element of that too. And so again, sticking to my journey, I definitely felt that leaving religion, I was also dragged kicking and screaming to certain conclusions. And yet I also was not particularly happy as a religious person, right? So that was partly there of like, I don't really fit into this world. And then intellectually, I was dragged kicking and screaming to certain conclusions. But emotionally,
Yeah.
I think in this case, it was both emotionally and intellectually being dragged kicking and screaming, right? Like I did not want to confront just the heaping piles of horror that I mean, we can get into it, but just
Yeah.
really looking at what's happened over the last 100 years is devastating. And
Right.
no part of me really wanted to open my eyes to that. Whereas with religion, I think there was a part of me that was like, oh, I don't want to know that this is false, but also I kind of do, because this is like, now I get to be free. So this seems
Exactly. Okay.
different. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, so I find that validating, because that is something that's basically what I was saying as well. So I like that you're kind of had a similar experience. So let's dive in. I love that we got like little sneak previews, little what's it called? When the author lets you know what's going to happen towards the end.
A teaser.
Foreshadowing.
Yeah.
There's some foreshadowing
Yeah.
there. Mike is not a Zionist anymore, guys. Sorry to ruin the suspense.
Don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone.
But let's start at the beginning. And actually, I'm going to try to keep the similar format to what we do when we talk about religion. And so let's talk about, how you were raised growing up, like home, school, society. What was the attitude towards Israel and Zionism? And those might be different.
Yeah, I mean, we were raised in a household, as you were there. We were raised in a household that wasn't particularly Zionist. And so funnily enough, we actually got less of the propaganda that I think your typical Israeli gets, because we went to extremely religious schools that didn't give a shit about anything except, what flavor of popsicle God wants you to have on Tuesday. And so we actually didn't get particularly indoctrinated into Zionism. And maybe this is something I haven't really thought about too much, but I'm wondering now out loud if that contributed to it being maybe relatively easier to rip the Band-Aid off than it might be for your average Israeli, having gone through an entire system that is perfectly calibrated to making you an ideal Zionist at the end of the pipeline. We didn't have that.
Right.
So that's interesting. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. But so really, we didn't get that indoctrinated into Zionism, but we were definitely, I grew up in a world where there was just an ambient level of hate and racism that is unmistakable. And so we just, like the Arabs, they were never Palestinians, right? They were Arabs, which now I recognize as like a real erasure of their identity. But at the time, all Arabs, all billions of them are just one thing, and we hate them. And they're all trying to kill us. And there was like very little trust. And even though they were our next door neighbors, right? We grew up in the old city of Jerusalem, and they're right there across the street, essentially, in the Muslim quarter. And like, they're terrifying to us. And if they just could, they would like lynch us immediately, right? That was really such a strong, I recognize that I had a very aversive reaction to Arabic. If I heard Arabic, it didn't feel good in my body, right? Like there's a signal of something bad. And there were many times in school where like Arabs would walk through our courtyard or whatever, and kids, and we're talking about young kids, would just beat them up for no reason, just for the sin of being not like Arab. So that was for sure the waters that we were swimming in. And so even though I didn't get a lot of the Israeli history and the propaganda and the Zionism, I did feel very strongly that they just hate us for no reason. They want to kill us. why do they hate us so much? And therefore, they're just fundamentally bad, you know.
Yeah. I want to talk with you later on in the episode, if we have the time, about Haredim and Zionism and the military, because I find it a very fascinating in between world where we'll talk about it more, but the Haredim are probably the most racist and probably the most morally, religiously justified in doing whatever they want, but they happen to not believe in Zionism. But when those two meet, when there is some sort of nationalism that emerges, if it's not Zionism, Haredim could be potentially the most dangerous. And you and I have spoken about this offline. It's very interesting how we were raised, and I find like in some ways I'm like the keeper of records for the family because I'm the eldest of how our parents were, because they over time I think became more Zionist. And it's also really strange the things that they did or didn't buy into. Like I've mentioned to you, our father was involved in protests, a lot of right-wing protests against any sort of peace process, against Rabin, against the Golan being returned was a big one when I was a kid. There was the talks about that. There were these settlements that were being built in the outskirts of Jerusalem. And I remember once he got arrested for protesting in one of those. Then he held for a few hours and stuff like that. And I remember being struck by that. And yet he wasn't Zionist. And yet when he didn't want us to join the military, and he also actually withheld citizenship from us for a few years. The Orthodox Jews, especially the society that we were raised in, like Zilberman's, the specific school, was this interesting mix of land-based kind of thing. It wasn't about self-governance, but it was about getting as many Jews into their homeland as possible, and almost like a rejection of Zionism because of its secular aspects. Like they wanted something even more religiously fundamentalist. Zionist secular undertones didn't fit for them. And that's something that Zilbermans didn't care who was the government, but they wanted to occupy as much of the land as possible. And I think our parents had even more of a nuanced thing where they kind of thought it was pretty good that Zionists were ruling, but it could be even better if like some guy with kippah was the prime minister of Israel. That was like the ideal goal.
That's interesting. And yeah, you have a much better grasp of that, like that, the history there. And I like don't remember anything about that when it comes to our parents, but I think it's another good example of the disconnect between where they were and where we were based on our schooling, right? So we were getting a very particular flavor of things that might not have been exactly in line where they stood. Like, for example, Israeli history was just not taught in our schools because nothing really was taught in our schools, right? So even the propaganda version of Israel's history, we didn't get. I didn't know shit about nothing. Like the very fundamentals, what happened in 48, what happened in 67. I'd get a little bit of it at home. And, our famous historian, Uncle Kenny, would pontificate and you could learn from him. But really fundamentally, a lot of it happened for me in my 20s once I left Israel and I was just started to get curious on my own about the history. But we just didn't learn anything, even from an Israeli perspective. Right. It was like it was like God gave us the land, and now today everything in between is pretty much irrelevant, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it was interesting because Shatora, again, claimed to be Orthodox Jewish, but they had some really weird Zionist motifs that they embraced. There was a Israeli flag flying on the roof of the building, which is a big no-no in regular Orthodox Jewish society. A lot of the rabbis had done some sort of army service. They created their own settlement called Male Amos, literally a yeshiva, Orthodox Jewish yeshiva, creating a settlement. I don't know if people realize how unusual that is to not be religious Zionist, but just be supposedly Orthodox Jewish and be a part of all of that. And I think historically, Noah Weinberg, who created Aish, was very struck by the 1967 victory. It's what inspired him, I think, to move to Israel shortly after. And I think he felt it really fit into his messianic worldview. It was like, this is it, guys. This is the sign. And I think there was a messianic fervor amongst Jews everywhere from what I read historically at the time. But him being religious, that was a key part of it. It was proof that the Jews needed to just repent and return to religion. And so he married these different views that were typically not combined in a way that just kind of worked for him and as, again, very unusual. But I like your point about how it mirrors. I talk about how us being raised a little bit secular made our leaving a little bit easier. And I'm hearing you say something similar here.
I wonder if the not getting the Zionist indoctrination is helpful in the end. I think also leaving Israel, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but I feel strongly that leaving Israel allowed for that kind of space and ability to look at the situation objectively. Like, I have so much respect for the four Israeli anti-Zionists because they are truly heroes, and it takes a very strong person to be able to see through their societal, scaffolding. So I think leaving Israel also is very, very helpful on this journey. And one last thing I'll say, just in response to what you said about Weinberg, I get why he would view it as like messianic. Everything about the Israeli project or the Zionist project is pretty miraculous, truly. It's such an improbable thing that happened on so many levels that if I was religiously minded, I would be tempted to look at this and say, this has to be divinely guided, because this should not have happened. From my perspective now, I look at it, it should not have happened, right? Like, it was, we can get into it, but it's truly a lot of things had to come together in a very specific way for this for this project to get off the ground. And it's very much unparalleled in history and is its unique flavor of thing that is pretty incredible, actually.
Right.
Incredibly.
And has allowed it to avoid scrutiny, actually,
right.
Because you can't point to anything else. And it's like, no, here's how we're different. And that has allowed a lot of apologetics to occur. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so continuing on, so I wanted to briefly touch upon your military journey. Actually, one thing I was reminded myself, a very similar parallel, where I left religion and I was still living in Israel for a year. I hated Israel, never liked living there physically. And I remember asking myself, if I'm not religious, why am I even here? Secular Zionism made no sense to me, right? Broadly, I think as a deconstructor, I think there's really baseline levels of code that I did buy into. But on the day-to-day, like, okay, you can believe in the idea, but why would you live here? Right? What's so great about a country that's just a random arbitrary country that the only significance is that, religiously was where you were, or historically 2,000 years ago you were. Like, that's all religion to me. And I remember being really, really struck by that. So kind of a parallel thing, I think, where we weren't fed the secular Zionism much. Ironically, our parents are more now, but that's a strange and recent development. So talk about your army service, actually, right? Because if you're coming from that kind of environment, how do you even end up in the army? And how was it like for you there?
My decision to join the army was very much tied into my leaving religion. And it was kind of almost just the default, okay, now that I'm not religious, what every secular 18-year-old in Israel does is join the army. It was a very, in retrospect, not a particularly deep calculus that I made there. It was essentially, I want to be part of Israeli society, and this is what you do. And then I thought, okay, if I'm going to do this, I might as well join a good unit. It's a very common mindset for 18, 19-year-olds. Like, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right. So I'm going to try to get into a combat unit or even special forces. So I ended up landing in an infantry unit and within like a special forces division of that unit, which I was very, elated about at the time, because I got selected. And we did a lot of training. And it was okay for a bit, but then around my second year of service, I started just feeling like I don't really fit in, and I started getting in trouble, and I was breaking some rules. And so the downhill spiral started around then and continued until my last day. By the time I was done, I was so over it. I think I hadn't particularly gone into the political side of things, but the way the military worked was very repulsive to me. Psychologically, it felt so messed up, what was happening. I saw a lot of abuse of power. I saw a lot of unquestioning obedience, which is literally what militaries are designed to do, but I didn't like that at all. And I saw a certain fervor for things that was pretty icky to me. So, for example, in 2000, my military service overlapped two Gaza incursions. One in 2012, one in 2014. And 2012, we almost went in. This is a year into my service, and we were on the border with Gaza for a week. Every night we would get into our armored vehicles, the engines would be on, and we were like, we're going. And then they would call it off. So it was a pretty terrifying week for me. I actually started smoking cigarettes during that week as a result of the stress. And what I noticed there was, I mean, I'm not going to implicate everyone in this, but the collective mentality or attitude was, hell yeah, let's do this. Let's fucking go fuck shit up. Like, this is what we've been preparing for. It was like exciting. And it wasn't even from a political place that I objected to that. It just felt wrong. Why are we excited about this? This is not a game. And in retrospect, knowing what happened in 2012 and 2014, especially 2014, because there was a ground incursion, that's horrifying that that's the attitude, right? And especially knowing now what just happened in the last 2 years. So I take pride in the fact that that really rubbed me the wrong way back then, before I had any political objection to the project. I just didn't like the pile-on, like cult-like superiority power trip thing that I was sensing in a lot of the military ethos, which again, from the military perspective, is very good. That's what you want.
Yeah.
So I'll pause there, but essentially I was very disillusioned with my service by the end of it. And it's part of what drove me out of Israel in retrospect. I was like so ready to be done. And I think very much in part because I did not like what I saw in the military.
How did that influence actually leaving Israel? And what were the other factors that drove you out?
I think it's very likely I would have left Israel regardless, just because there's so much opportunity here, and Israel has, you would be the right spokesperson to highlight all the difficulties with living in Israel. And so it might have happened regardless, but I think there was a certain urgency. I flew out of Israel like a week after I got out of the army. I was ready to go. A lot of people stick around for a while and work and do their thing to say, I need to get out. I need to go. And I knew I was going. It wasn't like you'll remember this. I was saying goodbye to people, like final goodbyes, not like I'll never see them again, but I'm not going for a trip and coming back. I knew at the time that was it. I'm leaving Israel. And I think I just didn't, maybe in certain ways I recognize that culturally I just don't fully align with the Israeli mentality. Like in the military, I once again felt like an outsider at the end of the day. And it was recalling a lot of my experiences in religion, where everyone's like on a certain wavelength, unquestioning and like, hell yeah. And I'm just on the side being like, but how do we know if this is okay? Like, who says this is true? It was very much a recapitulation of that experience. And I didn't like it. And I didn't think that there was nearly enough space for questioning or for doing things differently. I mean, literally you have to take orders, and if you don't, you go to jail. It's as clear cut as it gets. So yeah, I don't know. That was a little rambly, but that's kind of like, it was not a positive experience for me in the end.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. So you move out of Israel, you weren't happy. There was a misalignment, but at the time, where did you stand broadly on this thing that we're now discussing around like Zionism and Israel and stuff like that? Do you remember where you stood?
I do remember, because I don't have to even go that far back. I mean, my anti-Zionism came online within the last year, right? Fully, like my full commitment to it. Very, very new. So as much as I'm going to be preaching from the pulpit here, I am freshly, card carrying in this world, because it's a very hard, I hope we can talk about just emotionally, it's a very hard Band-Aid to rip off.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, my default, I didn't really spend too much time thinking about it, to be honest. Once I left Israel, that was not top of my mind, but there was a curiosity. I did actually want to try to understand. So I started like reading books, listening to books about Israeli history from a more objective perspective, but they were also always the Israeli point of view. So for example, My Promised Land by Avi Shavit, 6 Days of War by Michael Oren. There's another one that I'm forgetting, but these kind of like classic books that tell you the history, they do get into more of the atrocities and stuff. So even then, even reading those books, my eyes were starting to open into the fact that I had just no idea that the Jews ever did anything wrong whatsoever in the history of this conflict. That was pretty eye-opening for me. But I still was getting the Israeli perspective, and I was not particularly primed to question the fundamentals. I was like, okay, so this is more complicated. We've done some things wrong. The settlements are not okay. But fundamentally, Zionism of course, like why would we? It was almost This is something I really want to mention, and I'm curious if you share this experience. There's something very fascinating to me that happens when my view changes on something, is that I almost lose contact with what it was like to believe the thing, to the point where it's hard to even recall. Like, so this happens with God, right? You believe in God until one day you don't, and then I don't, and suddenly I'm like, how did I ever believe that? And there's a similar thing with me here with Zionism, that even though I guess kind of by default was a Zionist, it's very hard for me to, now that I am very opposed to it and very clearly opposed to it, it's hard for me to really connect with the reasons why. I think it was just a default view that you have. If you had pushed me to a corner, I don't know if I would have been able to defend it that well. It's just what you are, right? It's just like, okay, yeah, of course, like there are different ways of doing Zionism, but fundamentally the project of Zionism is okay,
Yeah. For me, this is like a clue, and we'll talk about it more in depth because I don't want to go there just yet. Of this necessary for as a solution for anti-Semitism was so deep and fundamental that, well, it had to be somewhere, and it makes sense to do it here because it's where we used to be. We're the most justified here, supposedly, right? And there was a certain framing, and this is where the religious really came in for a long time, that everybody just hated that we were there because they were anti-Semites. Right? They don't like seeing us come back to our homeland. It makes them angry, right? Just like Egypt is losing its shit because Israel is, that kind of was how it was framed. So the religious undertones stayed with me even after I left religion because I had been raised in the apologetic historical narrative. There was the Arabs, and the Arabs had all just tried to expand their own land. And when they lost, but there was a lot of nuance. Like, they lost. That's why they're not here, because they lost the war. And never did I stop to question, like, when civilians lose a war, they don't have to relocate, right? Little subtle things like that are just presented as a given, right?
Yeah.
But we'll get there in a minute. Okay, cool. So you said like only in the last year, and so let's just dive right in. What was the impetus in this last year that kind of cracked things up?
Just to clarify, the last year is the anti-Zionist piece that clicked on, but I think really fundamentally my disillusionment or deconstructing process started October 7th, which it did for a lot of people. October 7th is fascinating. It's like a radicalizing moment. Some people were sent into more Zionism, like the lovely Sam Harris, who I've lost all respect for as a result of his trajectory from October 7th. People who become more supportive of Israel. And then there's people, and I'm in this camp, that it was such a devastating moment, from an Israeli perspective. And then the response was so catastrophic and horrific that it just forced me essentially very early on to start actually trying to understand the history of the conflict. So for the first time, and this is humbling, I guess, in its own way, but for the first time in my life, I really wanted to understand, and truly from like an objective place, which includes Palestinian perspectives and includes really listening and reading. And so that's what happened, and the rest was history. The truth is, it doesn't take a very long time once you actually are open to what happened to realize how problematic this project has been from day one. It doesn't. You could get all the information you need in one book. It takes a lot of denial actually to maintain the support for this. So once I opened up, that's all that was required. That was the piece that needed to come online. Once I was open to actually learning, then it all just happened on its own. And it still took over a year of consuming information before I was willing to like actually confront Zionism itself. But in the first year of the process, I was still just becoming gradually more and more horrified by what I was seeing in Gaza, but more importantly, what I was learning about what happened. For example, 1948, it's this time that we celebrate as Israelis, and learning what actually took place there is just unreal. The disconnect between how we are treated to think about 1948 and what 1948 meant for Palestinians, right? Absolute horror show that took place there. And then you extend that to everything, all of these moments, same for 67, 73, right? All these pivotal moments that you're propagandized to think these were like important moments for us, and you know, we did nothing wrong, blah blah blah. The truth of what happened there is very, very different, and always involves tremendous injustice and oppression of Palestinians.
Mhm.
So yeah, I can say more. I guess I'll add here that you were talking about the anti-Semitism piece being like a hook into the Zionist project. I think for me, there were also some propaganda talking points that were very effective until I started learning more and realized that they're just not true. But for example, the no partner for peace thing is a very good one, right? Is like, we've tried so many times to solve this and they just don't want to play ball. So what are we supposed to do? That's like very, I have to credit Israel on its propaganda operation. They're good. It's not working anymore because you can't commit a genocide and think that your propaganda is going to save you. But historically speaking, Israel has been very, very good at coming up with these pithy little slogans that capture a lot, that have nothing to do with what actually happened in history, but they're very convincing for someone who's looking to be convinced. So no partner for peace is a big one that I had to shed, right? And I can track like when that happened. It happened when I was reading Rashid Khalidi's 100 Years War of Palestine. And so it's like, yeah, no partner for peace. True. It's just flipped. It's precisely flipped, right? Where Palestinians had no partner for peace. It's not the other way around.
Right.
So anyway, I'll pause there, but there were different pieces that I can track in my trajectory of like when that part got unhooked for me. And
I like that. I would like to dive into a bit more of that, because it's funny. I think a lot of times in the world of like when I interview someone who left religion, I don't typically dive too deep into like, you know, was there this specific book or that specific idea? Like, it's broad strokes and people can do what they want. But it's more like of a given. Like if this is a podcast that's going out to other non-religious people, it's like, okay, yeah, so you know Richard Dawkins and you know you've been immersed in those proofs. But in this area, it is so niche and so historical and so founded that there is, I think, more value in diving a little bit deeper into some of these points. The one thing I was going to point out, and I hear this a lot, people say, and I think I probably define myself, but October 7th changed my view. But I think it's inaccurate, because the date of October 7th, I was probably the most prepared to buckle down and buy into every single like, oh yeah, they just hate us and look what happens if there's no army kind of thing. It's actually like November 20th of the same year. It's about 2 months in when Israel's reaction was so disproportionate that it started to accumulate. Like as the death toll rose, is kind of for me what it was, the response to October 7th, not October 7th. That was the impetus. I remember months in being kind of like walking down a signpost, and it had done this calculation of like, oh, there's probably like 100,000 people who've died of hunger in Gaza. And this is early on in the war. And I was like, that's absurd. Like, you don't have, like, it's bad, but why do you have to go all exaggeratory? So, and I think it might have been exaggerating. I don't think it stoops anybody to exaggerate numbers, because the real numbers are so bad. But I remember like months in being like, nobody's taking us seriously. And I attended protests on behalf of the hostages. And so there was a lot of that going on in the first couple months for me. There was a cumulative effect in my journey, and October 7th kind of was sparked it. But if it had just stayed, if Israel failed this completely, because if they had just actually been strategic about it, they may have even done any of the tactical victories that they've done now while remaining the victim throughout, which they didn't.
Yeah, and when I say it started on October 7th, I think for me it was a similar thing where initially, like for example, Sam Harris put out a podcast pretty early on that he titled "The Bright Line Between Good and Evil," and you can guess who's good and who's evil here. And I shared that with people. It's cringy for me to remember this now because I'm so opposed to what he was arguing in there. But at the time, it spoke to me. He was basically saying, like, don't pretend like these are equivalent things. What Hamas did and what Israel is doing. And granted, Israel had done a lot less at the time. This was pretty early on. He was talking to like the woke pink-haired protesters on campus who are already shouting about what Israel's going to do before Israel even did that. As an aside, this is so interesting. People love to cite that to this day as like a proof of the unreasonableness of those protesters. Like, look, they were protesting before anything happened. Clearly, they're just like anti-Semitic or something. Whereas in retrospect, how are you making that point? If anything, they should get some sort of award for foresight. They knew before any of us knew exactly how this was going to go. They should be so vindicated in having protested the day after October 7th, because they saw what was the writing on the wall. And it's funny that to this day, people use that as like, you see, they were unreasonable if they were put. It's like, how are you saying that 2 years into this? Sorry,
Right.
that was just a rant.
and no, and I think no, it's perfect, and it actually fits in with the reason they were doing it is because they were educated and they were founded on 70 years of previous Israeli history.
Right.
It was an educated guess on their part as to how this too was going to go down based on what they knew until now and the ideals that were there. So it's the ability of religious people, and I guess the Israeli propaganda machine, or nationalists really, because I don't think the U.S. is faring much better. Is to flip things on its head. So to turn something that is like deeply wrong and be like, it's proof that I'm right, is unparalleled. It's amazing to see. Yes. I would love for you to give a few more examples, probably the most salient would be the ones that come up first for you, of those and I would divide it into two, but you could group them, of either historical things you didn't know about or specific arguments that, in the broad strokes, deconstructed, and maybe, the moment that happened. Like just naming Rashid Khalidi as the No Partner for Peace, that's perfect. I think that really gives people a nice little trail of crumbs that they can pursue.
So I mentioned one, I think that was very important for me, and Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine was very formative there.
That's for the 1948 one.
Yes, 1948, realizing how bad that was. And for example, here's a specific detail that kind of cuts across the propaganda. What's the propaganda for 48? Is we were attacked, right? The propaganda moves I've come to see are they're rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat for every conflict. So the rinse and repeat propaganda move is this was defensive. We were attacked unreasonably. We don't ask questions why they attacked. They just attacked, right? And then we did what we needed to do, and we ended up in a better place. But what am I going to do about that? It's war. That's you get that for 48. You get that for every single. You get that now for Gaza. Don't start a war if you don't want to lose it, is the line that you'll hear a lot. And so for me, learning that 250,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed before the 48 invasion by the Arab armies is like nail in a coffin of that propaganda. Even if that wasn't the case, that would be a ridiculous narrative, because you need to ask, why did they attack? But even on the terms of the propaganda, it doesn't work, because a third of those were cleansed before a tank made contact with Israeli territory, right? Or the partition plan, right? And so
couldn't the claim be made that was part of the civil war? There was a 8-month civil war before the official war from other countries came in, and so that was just a result of a civil war happening, that there was still a war happening on that level?
There wasn't a war happening. There were sporadic, occasional retaliatory things, but there were they didn't have armies. The Palestinians didn't have any armies, right? There was some resistance that was going on, but I think by any stretch you couldn't call that a civil war. There was tension. You don't get to kick out 250,000 people because there was some tension, right?
Right.
And so there are a lot of things like that where I realized, another one is they didn't accept the partition plan.
Right.
Right. And it's so interesting in retrospect that works. It worked for me. Why didn't they accept the partition plan? They are unreasonable. So the partition plan is the 1947 UN partition plan that allocated half of Israel, the better half of Israel, to the minority of Jews that were living there. It was never it was never a collaborative approach. It was very much favoring the Zionists, right, who were lobbying for this for a long time. And it was never discussed what would happen, for example, to the Palestinians in the Jewish state. There were some very important details that even if you wanted to implement this, it was completely unclear what would happen to, if you're going to have a Jewish state, there was going to be a lot of Palestinians in that territory. What would their status be? And we know now in retrospect that the Zionists were not planning on actually sticking to that. It was always an expansion or an expansionary project, and they were just going to accept whatever they can get legitimately before they push for more. Right, that's one of the moves. You take what you can get legitimately, and then you push for more. So, but back to they didn't accept it. In retrospect, that whole partition plan was completely illegitimate. right? Why did they have any right to allocate half of their land to outsiders? And why would the Palestinians accept that, right? You put yourself in the Palestinian shoes for 3 seconds, you realize that you would never, ever in the history of the world accept something like that because it's completely unjust and colonial in nature. So
Yeah.
it's so interesting that we take this completely unfair proposal and say, oh, they didn't accept it, so they're the bad guys. It's back to your point you made a second ago. There's so many backwards, like the world being flipped backwards, where you're taking the unjust and making it just and blaming the victim for being unjust. There's a lot of that happens, and somehow it works. It's truly amazing to me. Yeah.
Yeah. It involves, it requires a masking of the actual reality. That's a key part of it all. I once wrote an article. One of my first anti-Zionist articles was actually just imagine the tables flipped. And I specifically staged it in like some fictional Poland or something like that, where the Jews have been living there for centuries. And then suddenly somebody decides that, you know, it's not theirs anymore. Of course, we would reject it. And even if we lost the war, it would be this like heroic Warsaw ghetto uprising kind of narrative, which I think the Palestinians have around fighting for your own justice, even if you lose. Right.
Yeah.
So there's the aspect of it all. I'll share my own little anecdote that I did not know about. I was already not religious. I was 27 within a year of leaving. And I was working with Orthodox Jewish clients in Givat Shaul Har Nof area, a neighborhood in Jerusalem. And they were like, oh yeah, this factory that we're built on, this is the location of Deir Yassin. And I was like, oh, what's Deir Yassin? Right. And then I had to like go Google it. Okay. So that was the level of not, you know, the site of one of the most historic massacres right in the outskirts of Jerusalem. That was perpetrated by a person who then became the prime minister of Israel, who's got highways named after him, right? Talk about supporting terrorism. Right. So I did not even know about it. Right. So that it's a combination of like, keep your own population uneducated and then give them like talking points, you know, like the equivalent. We see this in religion as well. Okay, awesome. I appreciate you diving into depth around that because it really does kind of touch upon something. To me, the Accepting the Partition Plan, also Rashid Khalidi's book, really helped put that in perspective as well.
I think actually I want to add one more piece because this is, I think, connecting to the Zionism part. I think what really came online for me was realizing that if you look at the history from the perspective of the Zionist aim, it actually all makes sense. And it takes a lot of work to individually go into every case and explain why it accidentally happened, right? Which is kind of the narrative. You start in like the early times. They were really trying to just come and live in peace with the Palestinians, but then they accidentally had to not because Palestinians didn't want to. And then 48, they were really going to just accept the partition plan, but then they had to take more and expel 750,000 because Palestinians weren't playing ball. 67, they were just going to live peacefully, right? And be perfectly happy. And Palestinians could have a state and it would have been perfectly fine. But Palestinians decided to attack. So then they had to take all of their land and never give it back because like they had to for security.
Except it was Egypt and Jordan.
Right. No, none of this makes sense. But really, the move you have to make is that this was never intentional. It was always
thrust upon them.
It's always thrust upon, and like it could have been different, right? If only. And it actually is so much simpler if you look back and realize, no, from the outset, the prominent form of Zionism was expansionist. It was exclusionary to Palestinians. Of course, that's literally baked into the idea of Zionism, which is a Jewish state. You have to maintain a Jewish majority. It always wanted more land. It always was going to disenfranchise Palestinians or ethnically cleanse Palestinians. That was always the goal. And when you look at it from that perspective, then it all makes sense. Every time there was an opportunity to move in that direction, that's what you see, like clockwork. And it's why people were protesting on October 7th, because they knew, okay, here's another opportunity for Israel to move the needle. So it's weird for me that it took me so long to recognize that. But once I recognize that, it actually all clicks in. And then you go, oh, okay, it's the ideology itself that has been leading to all of this, right? It's not like the move that people try to make is defend the ideology. You see this in religion a lot. Defend the ideology, but argue that it was implemented incorrectly. Like, no, Zionism is okay. It's just it's been done in ways that are not ideal. You get this all the time. Like, no, Judaism is good. This is not real Judaism, right? This is like
separating the people from the religion.
Yes, like they're misinterpreting what it's about, and it's like, no, actually, yes, you can cherry pick and find some early Zionists who were very egalitarian and had a cultural Zionism and things like that, but they were truly outliers. And it's not even fair to call what they believed in at this point Zionism. They had different ideas. In terms of historically, Zionism has meant something very specific, and we see what it looks like. If it walks and talks like this is what it's about. And so that also, I think, was a huge shift for me when I recognized that this is actually all makes sense. It's all downstream from if this is what you're trying to create, which is a Jewish majority state in a land that already has people. That's not going to go well for the people there. So just wanted to add that piece because the propaganda is always, we were forced, our hand was forced to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think where to go next from here. Are there, I guess as a counterpoint, are there arguments that Zionists make that are harder to reject or that make some amount of sense? I think it's fair to at least dive into that.
I think it's I like that question. No. That's a great question. I think the most honest argument for Zionism that I can think of right now is I'll just label it the Jewish exception due to anti-Semitism, right? Which goes something along the lines of anti-Semitism is such a uniquely evil and powerful force in the world that Jews basically get an exception. They get to do this thing that we would not allow in other circumstances and is not fair to the Palestinians. This is why I'm saying this is the most honest version, because it's actually acknowledging that it's not okay.
Fair.
Not fair. But you got, like, anti-Semitism is just that bad. Now, I don't think this is a particularly good argument, right? Two wrongs don't make a right kind of thing, right? You can't subjugate other people because you've been subjugated. But at the very least, I respected the honesty where it's acknowledging that this has been horrifying for the Palestinians, and it's just by necessity because anti-Semitism. That's really the only, at this point, justification that I can at least respect on its own terms. Everything else is completely denialistic, I think I just made up a word. It doesn't confront what's actually happening. And so those are not arguments worthy, right, of like, yeah. So I'm curious if you can think of any more, but yeah.
No, I like that one. I think the biggest flaw, and again, there's going to be a flaw with any of these, obviously, because it's not very aligned. But the flaw with that one is why does it have to be Israel? Like, there's still, I believe, like, Germany post World War II, parts of, almost everybody at some point was like whatever. So like Canada, there would be the indigenous of Canada or the United States. But there are large swaths of land that were at that point available, and to be like, no, you go and bother those other people instead of whatever the world. That collective, well, Germany would have been logical next. Germany is a huge country, right? Partition off a place that say, okay, this is where the Jews get to have their own tanks now to protect against us. That would be a perfect arc of how it does. But it's like, oh, go to the weakest people you can find somewhere across the pond where it's nobody's problem and you guys can duke it out there. I find you mentioned something that reminded me. Palestinians talk about Jabotinsky being one of the only honest Zionists. And ironically, he's one of the most far-right extremists. He's like, kill all the Arabs. This is a war of blood. He was very militaristic and did not mince words. And his followers, people like Begin and the right wing that we have today in the Israeli government, very honest. Right? Just saying it like it is. And honestly, it's refreshing, right? Because you would rather somebody who wants to kill you just say that they want to kill you. And that would not have been successful, though. I think Zionism's trick is that for most of the part, it kind of wears sheep's clothing, and that's taken it way further.
Yeah.
And
no, I think that's a great point. Early Zionists were very aware of the fact that what they're trying to do is very controversial. And to their credit, from their perspective, they knew to not just shout it out loud, right? And you see hints of that to this day. It doesn't work as well, but Netanyahu is famous for speaking out of both sides of his mouth. He has one version of his framework in English for us Americans, and then he has what he tells Israelis. And when you speak both languages, you have the privilege of realizing that they're completely different stories. So yes, there's always been a lot of astuteness around how to sell this project. And there was one other thing I was going to add. I think, we'll see if it comes back.
Okay, nice. Phew. Okay. So very rapidly, it sounds like things unraveled, right? And suddenly, this whole world view of like that's like the kind of the given baseline kind of falls apart. Where do you find yourself on the other side, and on every level? Like start with like emotionally and intellectually, I guess.
So emotionally, it's been very difficult. I think we haven't spent much time on Gaza in this conversation, but watching what Israel has done to Gaza has been devastating and really forced a reckoning for me with what I think we, and we being my community, the people, the place I grew up, people I associate with, what we are capable of doing and supporting. Right? There's almost this default assumption that goes unquestioned, I think, for a lot of us, which is really bad things happen by other people at the hands of other.
We're always the victims. We're
Right,
always the
or we
victims.
can do some bad things, but we can't do the worst things. We can't do that. We're not capable of that. We're not built that. As our brother Broseph would say, we're built different. We're built
Yeah.
different. Yeah.
We have a deep moral compass that only has us do the right things with a few outlying bad apples, which we as a collective condemn at all times.
Yes. And so watching day after day the IDF commit just the litany of war crimes that most genocide scholars now, including Israeli genocide scholars, and most human rights organizations, including Israeli human rights organizations, are calling a genocide, right? And they've killed, I don't know what the most recent numbers are, but like 60,000. It's probably a much higher number than that because of people that are still under the rubble. The proportion of that being women and children, like insane numbers. Anyway, it could go on and on and on. It doesn't take very long if anyone wants to look at what's happened there. And so being forced to see that happen at the hands of the place that I come from has been very, very difficult. And there's always a temptation to look away, right? To not actually see it. But I think for me, it's felt important to keep my eyes open and to really take in what's happening. And so that's one piece of it. And then I think also it's just hard to recognize that as a Jewish anti-Zionist, you are very much like fringe. I think that's changing. But in terms of our immediate circles, everyone just defaults to support of Israel, right? When I meet a Jewish person in the US, I oftentimes just assume that they're probably supportive of Israel, or at the very least Zionist. Maybe they criticize Netanyahu, but they would still be like pro-Zionist. So it's a kind of an isolating place to be in that respect as well, of like losing community and almost being afraid to, I mean, in many ways, this conversation is kind of like me coming out of the closet. A lot of people I think don't know how far my views have shifted on this, and I don't go out of my way to like announce it. And so I think it can be isolating and scary from a relational perspective to be open about this stuff. And I've had, as I'm sure you have, a lot of fights and arguments with people in our orbit around these topics in the last few years, and it doesn't usually go very well. So yeah, definitely challenging, but also very, very clarifying, I think, in the end. A lot of clarity that's come with this for me.
Clarity implying that until now there was a lack of clarity, right? You weren't like, were you living in confusion and now it's like all settles down, or clarity is in like conviction?
Conviction and like moral clarity. It like it's very strong alignment with like how I view the situation and my values. Whereas if I was trying to still support this or somehow defend it or anything, I would be doing a lot of heavy lifting to make that happen. And the cognitive dissonance would be tearing me apart from the inside. So it's actually quite relationally, it's difficult, but inwardly, there's a lightness because it's just in line with reality, I think, history, and then my values, right? It actually feels quite good when things click into place that way, where it's just like, okay, actually opposing this makes a lot of sense, right? It feels like a weight lifted off. And then there's another weight that gets added because now you're like pushing against the status quo. But internally, it feels very clarifying, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So my follow-up questions to you about, so you say keeping your eyes open, right? You want to look away, but you keep your eyes open. And what are the emotions that come with that? And how do you process that? It can be very heavy.
Yeah. It's very heavy. A lot of grieving that I've had to do over the last couple of years in coming to terms with what's happening, and also just the history, right? Coming to terms with what's happened across history. And fundamentally, I haven't mentioned this yet, but I wrote about this in a piece like a year ago. I think the biggest thing that's been hard for me to confront, but also very important for me to confront, is how much I was dehumanizing the Palestinians. Like, I didn't actually see them at all. When I lived in Israel, definitely, they basically didn't exist. They were this kind of amorphous threat that congeals together, this black cloud that you just try to stay away from, but certainly not real human beings. And then even when I left, again, I was learning about the history, but from Israeli perspective, I never really confronted Palestinian humanity. And that's a pretty devastating thing to recognize in oneself. It's like how actually easy it was, given the power incentives and the fact that I was in the privileged side of this. I didn't need to. I didn't need to give a shit about what they were going through because it didn't affect me. And so that's been pretty challenging to confront, that I too am capable of that. And once I started actually looking at Palestinians as humans, the whole equation starts to change, right? Dehumanizing does a lot of work in this whole process, does a lot of heavy lifting. It's very hard to defend this project if you're not dehumanizing to some extent. And so, or othering, or whatever word you want to use, right? So I had to confront that in my own system. And that's also it's very humbling. And there's a part of me that's like, I don't want to look at this. But I don't know, for whatever reason, it's felt meaningful for me to stay the course with this process, even though there were always temptations to get off the train.
Right.
And I'm really glad that I did. Yeah. It's been overall very rewarding journey for me. Yeah. And it's been very helpful to have others like you who have gone through a similar process, and we have like a little community around it. And so it's very helpful to have other people that you can talk to about these things, because it can be very isolating. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. The isolation, people talk about isolation post leaving religion. I found it way worse. And maybe that means I was never as bought into religion or as committed, or people are more liberal towards, Jews certainly are more liberal towards you leaving religion. So you lose even more of the people who you believed would be there for you when you left religion are not there for you, for example, when you leave Zionism.
Right.
So it's very, very isolating.
Like, you've gotten more backlash for your anti-Zionist pieces than you did when you were like arguing against religion, right?
By far.
Yeah.
By far. And it's across the boards, meaning if I post something against religion and then the religious people come out of the woodwork, I'm like, these are people who anyways I don't really believe in, and I don't respect them, and I very obvious that their flawed thinking is right there. It's very glaring. So fuck them, basically. But then when people who I supposedly respect and who I thought better of and who are supposedly peers, they come out and are part of it, it's way more destabilizing. It's way more of a feeling of like almost second guessing yourself. Like, how could all these smart people be saying that? I must still be wrong on some level. I must still be missing something, right? People who are like, I love your writing about leaving religion, right?
Yeah.
And so clearly they're on the side of thinking independently, and that they're still like the same person will be like, oh, so you want us all dead? You know, that classic like one line zinger that gets used. I've had that literally written to me. So I'm curious about like, okay, so there's all this continuous deconstruction and keeping your eyes open. Has that driven you towards certain action? And I'm aware that asking that is assumptive. It's assumptive maybe from my past of like, oh, if you care about an idea, you have to take action. And that's not necessarily true. So I do want to name that outright. What has that been for you around activism or anything like that?
So yeah, something I've come to learn about myself is I don't have an activist bone in my body, apparently, or at least not traditionally how that manifests. So I've dabbled. I've gone to like JVP meeting here in Sacramento, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is like Jewish anti-Zionist organization, and I do my little things. Like I support Peter Beinart financially because I think he's doing great work. I've written a few pieces that I think is a way that I find that I can contribute, is speaking out. I actually think as Jewish people, we're very privileged in our role in the sense that we can make a big difference by openly talking about this, because it's such a taboo, and because anti-Semitism is such a go-to move. We defy that move by renouncing this as Jewish people, because they can't, I mean, they still do hilariously call us anti-Semites, but it doesn't work as well when you're Jewish. So it's actually very important, I think, for Jewish people to speak out if they are anti-Zionist or opposed. So I haven't done a ton of activism and protesting and that kind of thing, but I'm very engaged and I like having conversations, especially if it's someone who disagrees and I feel like there can be a meaningful dialogue. I'll do that. And I've written pieces and that kind of thing. So that's been my way of going about it. I think fundamentally for me, it's felt the most important for me to get clear on things, right? Like, so it's been, a lot of this has been an inward journey of like,
Yeah.
I want to be as honest as I can with this situation. And so what that looks like down the line outwardly, I don't know, but I've written some pieces and yeah, so.
Awesome. And is there anything that gives you hope in this fucking shit pile of a mess?
Well, when you ask it that way.
Right? I'm priming you.
Well, actually, I'm reading right now Ilan Pappé's newest book. It's called Israel on the Brink, where he is kind of making a hopeful argument. So I think the silver lining, I guess, in this whole situation is that I think the dam has broken in a way that I don't think can be undone. People have seen too much, I think, worldwide in terms of what Israel is capable of and what happens when you have just total impunity. So clearly it hasn't really done much right now. And so it's very hard to view this as hopeful when you have Palestinians in Gaza being massacred and starved and half of their land is stolen, right? Something that people aren't talking about, that Israel just stole half of Gaza in this peace ceasefire proposal.
Ceasefire.
Yeah. And you said this very well earlier in the conversation. This is what the people protesting on October 7th knew. Once you look back at the history, there's a real playbook. There's like moves that happen over and over again. And so if you know that, you can predict how this is going to go. So this not giving back the land is not shocking when you look at the moves that were made over and over again throughout history of this conflict. You take advantage of conflict to acquire more land, right? That could be in the Zionist playbook. And so we're seeing it happen again here. So it's hard to be hopeful with all of that, but I do think that overall attitudes, there's been a sea change in attitude towards Israel, especially amongst younger people, younger Americans. I think for the first time in the history of polling around this issue, there's a majority of Americans who don't support Israel, and younger Americans especially, and even young Republicans, or just Republicans in general, which has been always like we can at least rely on the right wing of the US to support us. Even there are cracks now. And it's actually, there's a whole other conversation, but it's tearing the right apart in the US, the question of Israel. So there are a lot of cracks in the foundation. And the truth is, Israel never could have and still can't do anything without the US's support. Israel has this weird, if you want to like talk about it from a psychological perspective, this weird complex of it's like a kid living in their parents' basement, but feeling completely independent because they have like their own entrance. Yeah. Like they have their own entrance. So they're like, oh yeah, we can do whatever we want. I got this shit. But really, like if it weren't for their parents like funneling food down the stairs every day, they would die like within a day, So you have a very similar dynamic with the US. The US is really the only reason this project has been able to unfold in the way that it has. And so I'm not very hopeful that things will change from within Israel. I think that ship has sailed long ago, and any hope of that died, I think, on October 7th because of how traumatizing that was. But I do think from the outside, there's an inevitable shift that's occurring now that will continue to occur. And I think fundamentally, hopefully, will force changes on Israel from the outside, right? Like, for example, the next Democratic administration in the US could be very, very different in terms of its relationship to Israel. I mean, look at Zoran Mandani just got elected. He's openly anti-Zionist. That would have been unthinkable that someone could be that openly opposed to Israel and Zionism and win such a powerful position in politics. And he just did. And he also got a lot of the Jewish votes in the US, much to the chagrin of the ADL in France. And so I think hopefully, I mean, who knows how long this takes, but I do feel like in a way, because of how bad it got, it might lead to something different.
Right.
Yeah.
Ironically, the micro equivalent of the Holocaust that allowed the Jews to politically justify a state, that could be, I guess, full circle. Ironically, it goes to show you everyone's just fucking someone downstream is kind of like the takeaway,
right?
From
and
historically.
It really highlights just how much impunity there has been, right? Like, think about it from the Israeli perspective. Why would you, even from a self-serving perspective, you said this earlier, right? Why did you go so hard? And I think you have to kind of connect to the fact that they've been allowed to do whatever they want for 100 years.
Right.
Pretty much whatever they want. And that's intoxicating. It's just power. There's nothing particularly evil about Israelis and Jews. It's just human nature and politics and balance of power. And when you're allowed to do and get away with whatever you want, it leads to worse and worse things. And I think what we saw post October 7th was a culmination of that. If you get a blank checkbook to just lash out, steal land, kill Palestinians, and just over and over again have no repercussions, this is what it leads to. We see this over and over again in history. What's the line? Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, this is like perfect example of that. In a way, I mean, if you want like a compassionate framework of this, is that like Israelis are victims of their own superiority, their own power, right? They're being victimized by their own, just like, in a way, the US would have done Israel a lot of favors if they had been harder on them throughout history. But anyway, I digress.
No, I love it. I have one more question that I feel compelled to ask. I'm mindful of the time, so this might be a little bit of a longer answer, but my two follow-up questions are much shorter. How do you reconcile, and I'm aware that this is already coming from very binary thinking, but I still find I struggle with it, so I figured I'd run it by you. How do you reconcile the desire for Palestinian victory on some level, meaning I want them to have their own place, and I feel convinced that needs to happen militarily, with the fact that the losing side, like any loss, any Palestinian victory, which I'm rooting for on some level, results in a loss on a side that is kind of my side, if you will, on an emotional association. Does that make sense? The question?
No, that's a great question, and that's something that connects to your question from earlier about emotionally. It can be very confusing. It's very clarifying, as I spoke to, because it really value-wise, it's very clarifying. But it is emotionally confusing to be rooting for the other side, right? And in certain ways, like rooting against your people, your friends, and your family. So, for example, a small example of this is I support the BDS movement, which is boycott, divest, sanction. And that's basically supporting a movement that is designed to hurt the average Israeli. It's like a slightly confusing place to be, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I'm still very much there. So it doesn't lead me to like backtrack, but it does mean that it's a little bit it feels challenging to confront that, right? And so I guess on the bigger picture, I think the way I reconcile this, and in this I draw a lot from Peter Beinart's work, is that I think fundamentally Jews in Israel will be a lot safer without Zionism. So maybe I'm rooting for some short-term hardship for Jews, which is unfortunately how it would have to go, I think. But in the long term, I don't think the Zionist project has made Jews more safe, not in the diaspora and not in Israel. And so I think that that's kind of what allows me to continue to support it, because it's not like I'm saying I support the Palestinians, fuck Israelis, right? That's not where I stand. I'm standing in the place of I support Palestinians, and I think fundamentally if they get their rights, it'll be better for Jews as well in the long term. I'm not talking about the short term here, because the short term will require a lot of compromises on the side that has enjoyed a lot of power. Yeah. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I do. It is tricky. It's very tricky to be in this place of rooting for the away team.
The away team. Yeah,
Yeah.
you've got your home team and you're rooting for the away team. It's a very strange place to find yourself. My last two questions for you. One, briefly, what would be your advice to somebody else who is going through this process of deconstructing on the emotional, intellectual level?
Don't do it. Stay away. No.
Yeah.
I think a couple of things come to mind. First is, I would say, give yourself permission for it to take as long as it takes, right? It was a very gradual process for me. And this is something I try to remind myself when I'm thinking about or feeling judgmental of other people is reminding myself that I took as long as it took. And so just because I have clarity on it now doesn't mean that it could have happened any earlier, right? Things have to click in when they click in. And so, for example, if someone's like questioning Israeli policies and then they feel like, oh, if this leads to anti-Zionism, then I don't want to ask these questions. What I would say is, okay, don't think about that part, right? Just like take it piece by piece. I think that can, like, step by step, that can be very helpful. And instead of like worrying about where this culminates, right? Because that there's identity-wise, for me as well, we didn't talk about this so much, but there's something that was just hard, even when I was very much ready intellectually. Just calling myself anti-Zionist I just had to sit with it for a while before I was like emotionally ready to slap that label on myself, right? So these things take the time that they take. And then the other thing I would say is find community or find people that you can talk to about this, because that makes a huge difference to be able to connect. Like if you're Jewish, with other Jewish people who are questioning this, or just spaces with people that you can relate to who won't think you're crazy. Because part of the experience here is it's crazy making. It's, you sometimes feel like you're going insane of like, how am I thinking this is so wrong when so many people think this is okay? And so it's
not just okay, but the best thing that could possibly done, a victory of good over evil. Not like, it's not some neutral okayness. It's literally the best thing.
Right.
That's what we're standing at here.
Yeah. And so having people that can be kind of a reality check, who are like, no, you're not crazy. This is actually bad. Mm-hmm. No, you're right. This is bad. Can be very helpful. And that can be podcast, books, but especially just other people that you can talk to, I think is very helpful. And then the last thing I'll say is, like, this is not exactly advice, but I would just say, like, huge shout out to anyone who's, I guess right now I am thinking about Jewish people in my head. I think for any Jewish person out there who is willing to confront their default assumptions and indoctrination and propaganda that they've taken on over the course of a lifetime, and to start to unpack that, takes actually a lot of courage and moral fortitude to do that. So I give a lot of credit to anyone who chooses to get on that train. And yeah, and I think that'll make a huge difference. This is back to your question about activism. I do think that as Jews, we have a big role to play in this. Of like, I think if enough Jewish people start to disconnect from this project, that could have a big impact in the end. So I don't want to center myself in this whole story, but I do think we actually have a responsibility as Jewish people, because so much of this is being done in our name, in the name of world Jewry. So us standing up and being like, actually, no, not in my name, takes a lot of the wind out of the kind of the selling point. Yeah.
So my final question, you're famous for being a real collector of information and resources. And so I invite you to give a dump of any type of resources, books, podcasts that you have found the most engaging, and I'll just link to them at the bottom of the show notes.
Okay.
I know there's a lot.
Yeah, I've been kind of obsessed with this topic for 2 years now. So there is a lot, but I think a few that come off, I already mentioned, I think at least one, the top 2 books that I've been recommending, if people ask me, is Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza by Peter Beinart. And it's a fantastic book, specifically catered towards other Jewish people. And Beinart is the perfect spokesperson for this, because he himself has gone through a process of disillusionment and deconstruction and can speak to other Jews going through that process. And he's a very proud, religious, actually, Jew. So I have a lot of respect for him, and I think the book is fantastic, very short. And then 100 Years War in Palestine is a great, history 101 from the perspective of a Palestinian, where it goes against a lot of the narratives that you get told from the Jewish perspective, Israeli perspective. And then podcast-wise, actually, on the book front, a couple more that I'd recommend. Perfect Victims by, I believe it's Muhammad El-Kurd. And then One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. I'm blanking on the name of the author right now, but these are two Palestinian authors. Excellent reads, beautifully written. Just the title of that second one, I think, is award worthy. One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, right? Really captures. And so I think if you can already tell, like, listening to Palestinians, I think has been really important for me in this journey. Actual Palestinians, not people talking for Palestinians, which is crazy how little of that you get in mainstream media or just in like mainstream sources, like real Palestinian voices. So podcast wise, again, on that front, Makdisi Street, fantastic. It's 3 Palestinian brothers. They're all professors, super smart. And they have really interesting conversations and guests on there. I've learned a lot from their podcast. Peter Beinart, again, has a podcast that I like a lot. Bad Hasbara, I don't listen to it so much anymore, but it was a fun process of they go hard on the Israeli propaganda in a way that's kind of funny. But they also can highlight a lot of the absurdities that you get in the Hasbara wing of things. I'm trying to think. And there are a few Hebrew spoken podcasts that are pretty good. I don't know if that would be relevant for anyone, but Disillusioned is a good podcast where she talks to specifically Israelis who have become disillusioned with Zionism or Israeli policies. And then I'll leave it at that. There's more, but I don't want to overload. There are some YouTube channels as well that are doing really good work. I think that's cool. Like, that's talking about like hope. There's a lot of new content online now that if someone's interested in this question, there's a lot of, like, the amount of videos I've seen on YouTube that are like an hour and a half long, super high quality on really popular channels that are just like deconstructing Zionism or giving you the history of the conflict, that are all they were all produced post October 7th. Clearly there's like an appetite for this and it's being catered to. So if anyone wants, they can spend a day on YouTube and get really good quality education on this. So it's like a prime time now to be interested in this topic for anyone who is, because there's so much out there. Yeah. And a lot of things that were taboo are no longer taboo. Like, taboos have been broken in the good way. So you can say things now that it was not okay to say.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike.
Of course.
Appreciate you having you on.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Belief. If you found the episode inspiring, please share it with others who might benefit from it, and be sure to subscribe to it to get updates about future episodes.